On February 23, 1958, a Remington sales representative named Delbert Connor sat down and wrote a 4-page report to Wayne Leake, the chief firearms designer at the Ilion plant. And what he wrote in the opening sentence was this. His first impression of the guns he had been handed for field testing was that they were just toys, or maybe air rifles for Buck Rogers. He had carried 2 of them for 30 days under the company's instructions, firing a minimum of 1,000 rounds each in adverse conditions and returning his results. The guns were molded from plastic. They had no wood. They had no traditional blued steel receiver. They looked, to every gunsmith and salesman and traditional shooter who held them in those first months of 1958, like something from a toy counter or a science fiction film. Connor wrote the sentence about Buck Rogers, and then he kept writing, because the rest of what the guns had done to him over those 30 days was the opposite of everything the first sentence implied. The performance and accuracy, he wrote, were unbelievable. That gap between the first impression and the final verdict was the entire story of the Remington Nylon 66, compressed into one 4-page report filed on a February morning before the gun existed. The gun that came out of that report, and out of 3 years of testing before it, would become the most successful .22 caliber rifle Remington ever produced. Over 1,050,000 units by the time the last one rolled out in 1991, the most successful rimfire in the factory's history. The gun that the gunsmiths in Ilion did not want to build, that the salesmen did not believe they could sell, that the traditional firearms establishment dismissed without hesitation as an impossibility in plastic, had outsold every other rifle Remington had made. What Delbert Connor discovered in those 30 days in the field was the same thing every buyer who ever picked one up eventually discovered. The gun worked, in conditions and at rates, and with a reliability that no wood and steel rimfire of its era could match. The problem was the word plastic. The word was in the way of everything the gun actually was for 3 years before it reached the market, and for months after it did. You need to understand what the Remington plant in Ilion, New York, was in the early 1950s before you can understand what Wayne Leake was proposing. Ilion was a traditional manufacturing floor. The men who worked it had learned their trade from men who had learned theirs, from men who had been building wood and steel firearms since 1816, when Eliphalet Remington forged his first barrel on his father's farm in central New York. The culture of the floor was the culture of every gun-making floor in America at that time. Steel gets machined, wood gets fitted, and the result of those 2 processes, meeting, is a firearm. The idea that you could replace both the stock and the receiver with a single molded piece of polymer and still have something that deserved to be called a rifle was not a modest proposal in that environment. It was an affront to everything the floor understood about what a gun was. Gunsmiths, who were asked about the design in those early years, said what Delbert Connor wrote in his opening sentence. It looks like a toy. They did not mean the design might have problems. They meant it was not a gun. That distinction made what happened later all the more remarkable. A specific man at a specific moment is where this story starts. Wayne Leake headed the Remington Research and Development Department in Ilion in the early 1950s. He had been given a problem: produce a semi-automatic .22 rifle that was cheaper to manufacture than anything currently in the catalogue, competitive in price with what Winchester and Mossberg were offering, and accurate and reliable enough to carry the Remington name. The barrel was a fixed cost. You could not meaningfully reduce what it took to rifle a barrel. What you could reduce was the cost of the receiver and the stock if you could find a material that made both replaceable with something cheaper and faster to produce than machined steel and fitted walnut. Leake looked at the manufacturing analysis and saw one answer: polymer. The receiver could be replaced with a molded material if the material was strong enough. The stock could be molded from the same material in the same process. The entire assembly of stock and receiver could be produced as 2 hollow halves injected from a mold and bonded together, with a thin steel cover over the receiver area so the gun would not look like a toy and would provide a mounting surface for the rear sight. The mold would be expensive, every part thereafter would cost almost nothing. The man Leake needed was not in Ilion. He was in Wilmington, Delaware, working at the DuPont chemical laboratory known internally as Purity Hall. DuPont had owned Remington since 1933. The same parent company that made nylon for ladies' stockings in 1935 controlled the firearms plant in Ilion, and the polymer chemistry that had produced the nylon family of materials was available to be requested. Leake specified what he needed: a material that could be injection molded to any shape, high tensile strength, high impact strength, resistant to temperature extremes, from Arctic cold to desert heat, resistant to solvents, mild acids, and oils, not capable of continuing to burn after an initiating flame was removed, self-lubricating, stable in its dimensions after molding, neither shrinking over time nor warping. The last requirement was the one that made every traditional gunsmith dismiss the project without thinking about it further. A receiver that changes shape, changes the tolerances of every part it holds. A receiver that warps, changes the point of impact of the barrel. Wood was understood to warp. Whatever this plastic was, if it warped, the gun was finished. DuPont came back within months. The material was Zytel 101, a structural nylon from the polyamide 66 family of compounds, the same polymer lineage that had originally produced the nylon fiber. Leake and his team, which included engineer Charles Morse and several others, machined a prototype framework from solid bar stock of the material and began shooting it in July of 1955. An internal memo dated July 7, 1955, recorded that the preliminary action design had been completed. A full prototype was ready, and the first 75,000-round test was underway. The rifle consisted of two hollow nylon halves bonded together, with the semi-automatic blowback action enclosed within. The 14-round tubular magazine was housed in the buttstock, loaded through the butt plate at the rear. A thin, stamped steel cover wrapped the receiver area. The bolt and striker ran in grooves machined into the nylon itself. Because nylon is self-lubricating, no oil was required. The gun would run in Arctic conditions where petroleum lubricants congeal. It would run underwater. It would run in desert sand. The first 75,000 rounds confirmed it. The factory was not persuaded. This was the central problem of the years between 1955 and 1958. The gun worked. Leake and his team knew it worked because they had fired hundreds of thousands of rounds through it, under conditions designed to break it, and it had not broken. What they could not resolve was the institutional resistance of everyone whose opinion mattered between the test bench and the market. The gunsmiths looked at the nylon receiver and saw a toy. The salesman looked at the plastic stock and saw a product no American shooter would pay for. The model name at that point was 555, and the internal nickname Bearcat had been proposed. But Sturm Ruger introduced a revolver with that name in 1958, and Remington dropped it. The gun had no name. It had a material that the industry thought was for stockings and toys. The steel cover had been added specifically to address the toy objection, so that the receiver area at least looked like blued metal. But it was a thin piece of stamped steel over a nylon body, and the men who built guns for a living knew the difference. In January of 1958, Remington gave every sales representative two prototype 555s, one in olive drab green and one in a walnut pattern, and told them to fire 1,000 rounds each under adverse conditions and report back within 30 days. 30 men took them out. 30 reports came back in February. Most of them contained some version of what Connor wrote in his opening sentence: first impression, toy, Buck Rogers air rifle. Then they wrote what the guns did, and the pattern of the reports was the same. The gun ran in rain, the gun ran in cold, the gun ran in mud, the gun ran dirty. The guns came back with accuracy data that matched or exceeded what the walnut and steel 22s in the catalogue were doing. Connor's 4 pages were not unique. They were the pattern. The gap between the first impression and the result was consistent across 30 different men in 30 different locations. Remington had its answer, and the answer was the same from everyone who actually shot the thing. The answer was that the gun was better than it looked. The rifle that went to market in December of 1958 was named the Nylon 66 after the polyamide 66 family of materials. The number was the chemistry, not the model designation. 4,450 production rifles went out the door at $49.95 each, with Remington calling them the gun of tomorrow and the rifle of tomorrow in an advertising campaign that leaned into the futurism rather than apologizing for it. The initial colors were Mohawk brown and Seneca green, named for the Native American tribes who had lived near Ilion before Europeans arrived. The stock was guaranteed in writing not to warp, crack, chip, fade, or peel for the life of the rifle. That guarantee ran from 1959 through 1969, and it was not an empty marketing line. The material held. No one who owned one of those rifles and kept it in reasonable condition has found a stock that failed that guarantee. The year 1959 was when the gun proved what it was. Tom Fry was a Remington field representative and a championship exhibition shooter of the kind that firearms companies had employed since the days when Annie Oakley toured the country for Union metallic cartridge. In October of 1959, at the Holiday Hotel in Reno, Nevada, Fry set out to break the world record for shooting airborne targets that had been held since 1907 by Adolph Topperwein of Winchester, who had hit 72,500 wooden blocks with 9 misses. Fry used 3 off-the-shelf production nylon 66 rifles. 7 assistants threw 2.5-inch square wooden blocks into the air, one at a time. Fry fired at a pace of 1,000 shots per hour, 1 shot every 4 seconds, for 8 hours a day for 13 consecutive days. His trigger finger was cut and bleeding by the second day. He went to bed each night in pain and came back the next morning. When it was over, he had fired at 100,010 blocks and hit 100,004. 6 misses in 13 days of continuous shooting. The rifles had been cleaned only 5 times total. There had been no mechanical failures. The records do not show a single malfunction in that entire demonstration. The same receiver that the Gunsmiths in Ilion had called a toy ran 100,000 rounds of .22 long rifle through a nylon body with 5 cleanings and no failures. Remington could not manufacture rifles fast enough. First-year demand exceeded every projection. The production lines that the traditional gunsmiths had resisted staffing with pride were running at capacity, and it was not enough. The shooters who had dismissed the concept bought one, shot it, and bought another for their son. The trappers in Alaska and the Canadian North, who could not oil their steel rifles in cold that congealed every petroleum lubricant they owned, found that the nylon receiver required nothing. It ran dry. It ran frozen. It ran soaked. The gun that had looked like a Buck Rogers toy was the most practical small-game rifle the northern trappers had ever owned, and word of that traveled through the backcountry faster than any advertising campaign could reach it. You already know where you stand on this. You have always known. The traditional firearms industry in 1958 understood guns as the product of machined steel and fitted wood, because that is what guns had been since Samuel Colt first systematized their production. What Wayne Leake understood, and what the gunsmiths on the Ilion floor did not want to accept, was that a gun is a mechanical device, and a mechanical device works when its tolerances are held and its parts function together reliably. The material that held those tolerances did not have to be steel. It did not have to have the smell of Hoppe's No. 9, or the weight of a blued receiver, or the warmth of a walnut stock. It had to cycle the action and feed the cartridge and release the striker and extract the case and do it again 10,000 times, 100,000 times, in cold and rain and mud without failing. The nylon did that. The tradition did not care. The buyers cared. 1,050,000 of them proved it between 1959 and 1991, one gun at a time, each one a vote against the first impression and in favor of the result. There is a nylon 66 in a closet in a house outside Duluth, Minnesota right now. It is the Mohawk Brown model, made in 1963, and it has been in that closet for 50 years since the man who bought it knew died, and left it to his son, who brought it out twice a year for squirrels and grouse and then stood it back in the corner. The stock has not warped, the receiver has not cracked. The action cycles on the first stroke every time the boy, now a man in his 60s, runs it through its function check before heading into the timber. It has been cleaned perhaps 40 times in its life. It weighs 4.5 pounds. It will still fire a 14-round magazine without a malfunction every time, in weather that makes petroleum lubricants thicken and bind. The man who bought it new paid $49.95 at a hardware store in Two Harbors in 1963. He thought of it as a reliable small game rifle that was lighter than anything else on the rack and never needed oil. His son thinks of it as his father's gun. It is both things and also the physical result of what Wayne Leake drew on a drafting table in Ilion in the early 1950s when he decided that the material a gun was made from mattered less than what the gun did when you pulled the pros trigger. It is the gun, a DuPont chemist in Wilmington and a Remington engineer in Ilion, built from a material that existed nowhere else in any firearm factory on Earth in 1955. In a plant where the men whose opinion was loudest said it could not be done and should not be tried. The chain runs from that closet in Minnesota back to Purity Hall in Wilmington, where Wallace Carruthers and Gerald Burchett produced 81 new polyamides in 1935, and one of them was designated Fiber 66 and renamed Nylon. It runs from nylon to a request from Wayne Leake to the DuPont Polymer Department in 1952. It runs from that request to a prototype in 1955. It runs from the prototype to Delbert Connor's 4-page report in February of 1958, which opened with Buck Rogers and closed with Unbelievable. It runs from that report to the production line in December of 1958. It runs from the production line to Tom Fry, standing in Reno in October of 1959 with a bleeding trigger finger and 6 misses in 100,010 shots. It runs from Reno to every back window of every pickup truck in America where a nylon 66 rode through the 1960s and 70s because it weighed nothing and needed nothing and broke nothing. The factory record says 1,050,000 rifles sold over 32 years in production. The men who refused to build it are not on the record. Wayne Leake is on the patent, filed December 1958, granted March 1962. Delbert Connor's name is on the February report. Tom Fry's name is on the record in the Cody Firearms Museum, where 2 of his 3 demonstration rifles are preserved in the vault. The gun the Gunsmiths called a toy is the most successful .22 Remington ever made. Their names are not on it.